Eliza Graves was 24 years old and already invisible. She had learned, in the way of bruised things, to make herself small. She rose before the kitchen cat had stirred. She lit her candle from the coals and carried it to the hearth, and she blacked the grates. No one else would do it. That was the arrangement, unspoken. The other girls had their reasons, delicate and murmured. Eliza had her reasons too. She simply did not speak them aloud. The iron brush moved in long strokes. The cold of early January sat in the stones around her, patient as a creditor. She had no fire yet. She did not mind. She had grown accustomed to the cold that came before warmth. The candlelight was enough to see by. It was enough to work by. Her hands were capable hands, steady. She had blacked grates in 3 houses in as many years, and she had learned that a grate done well was its own argument. It did not require a character reference. It did not require anyone to speak on its behalf. That was fortunate. Eliza had no character reference. The last one had been burned. The accusation had been simple and clean, and entirely without proof. A silver brooch gone from Lady Vance's dressing table on a Tuesday. Eliza had been the one to arrange the room that morning. That was the whole of the evidence. Her presence, her proximity, the unfortunate fact that no one else had been there. Lady Vance had not pressed charges. She had done something worse. She had told her friends. The letter of reference, already written out and held in trust by the housekeeper of that establishment, had been taken back and set in the grate. Eliza had not been shown the flames. She had only been told, the next morning, that there was nothing to give her. She had kept her face very still. She was good at keeping her face still. That was 3 years ago. Since then she had moved down, from lady's maid to parlour maid, from parlour maid to kitchen girl, and now to this, the scullery at Ashmore Hall, the lowest rung on a staff that had no use for her above it. She arranged winter-flowering jasmine in an earthenware cup when she found sprigs near the kitchen garden wall. She kept her mother's thimble in her apron pocket and a darned glove on the stone shelf above her pail. These were her anchors. She did not examine them too closely. She was grateful for Ashmore Hall. She had not expected to be. Mrs. Hartwell found her at 6:30, already on her second grate. "The Duke arrives today," Mrs. Hartwell said. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, her cap very straight. She was a woman who wore her authority quietly, the way some women wear good jewellery, present, visible, never flaunted. You are to remain below stairs the whole of the day. If you are needed for coals, use the servants' passage. Do not be seen on the main stair. Do not pass through the entrance hall. If he comes below, step into the larder. She paused. I say this for your sake as much as any other. Yes, Mrs. Hartwell, Eliza said. She understood. A girl with no reference and an uncontested accusation was a liability, and a grieving duke in a hall already weighted with sorrow was not to be further burdened. She returned to her brush. She heard the carriage before she saw it. The sound came first as a tremor in the flagstones, something heavy, at speed, slowing. Then the crack and press of frozen gravel under iron wheels. Eliza set her brush down. She crossed to the narrow window, cut low in the basement wall, the one that looked sideways across the front drive, and she wiped the frost from the glass with her sleeve. The coach was dark. 4 horses, breath rising white in the January air. A groom leapt down before the wheels had fully stopped. Then the door swung open and a man descended. He was tall He wore a black coat, and he moved without looking at the house. He moved like a man who had somewhere else still to be, like arriving was a habit his body had retained, while the rest of him had gone somewhere unreachable. He did not pause to take in the facade. He did not look up at the windows. He simply walked through the door. Eliza watched until the entrance swallowed him. She stayed at the glass a moment longer. Then she turned back to the stone shelf. She picked up the darned glove and set it in her apron pocket, next to the thimble. She lifted her candle. The flame held steady in the still air of the basement, burning without audience, burning all the same. She said it very quietly. She did not know why she said it. "I am here," she whispered, "even if no one looks." She returned to the grate. The carriage arrived at 2:30, when the light over the park had already begun to give itself up to January. Ashmore Hall heard the wheels on the gravel before any servant did. The chimneys drew a little sharper. The long passage near the kitchen exhaled a breath it had been holding since October, and the candles in the entrance hall burned suddenly, collectively, without a flicker. Edmund Ashmore, Duke of Grantham, stepped down from the carriage without waiting for the footman. He was 36 years old, and he moved like a man who found rooms too small, not from arrogance, but from a grief that had grown large inside him, and had nowhere else to go. He did not remove his coat. He crossed the threshold of Ashmore Hall with it still buttoned to the throat, as though he meant to be somewhere else before the evening was done. Mrs. Hartwell had arranged the senior staff in 2 careful rows across the marble floor of the entrance hall. She stood at the head of them, straight-backed, composed, her keys quiet at her hip. She had arranged this very presentation many times for the late Duchess. Her expression gave nothing away. "Your Grace," she said, "welcome home." He inclined his head. He did not smile. He walked slowly along the row of faces, the butler, the first footman, the lady's maid who had nobody to attend, and he looked at each of them with eyes that were not unkind. But they were the eyes of a man going through emotion, meeting a social form that had once meant something, and now meant only the passing of time. Eliza watched through a hairline gap in the door panel at the top of the servants' stair. She should not have been there. Mrs. Hartwell had been quite clear on that point. Eliza was to remain below during the arrival. She was to be invisible, unremarkable, a shadow that asked nothing and offered nothing. And so she crouched on the landing with one hand against the cold wall and one eye pressed to the narrow seam of light, barely breathing, as though even the air might carry her presence down into the hall below, and she watched the Duke of Grantham stand among his own people like a man standing in a country he no longer recognized. She noticed that he did not linger. He moved through the presentation as a man moves through a corridor, purposefully and without pleasure. A word of acknowledgment for the butler, a brief nod for the footman. His gaze passed over the assembled faces and found each of them politely empty, as though the household were a painting he had seen before and could not bring himself to examine closely. She had seen that look before in houses where unhappiness had taken up permanent residence. Then he paused. There was a side table near the foot of the stair, a small half-moon of dark walnut placed below a gilt-framed mirror. On it stood 2 silver vases, formal and gleaming and entirely bare, as the season gave little enough, and between them sat a plain earthenware cup, rough at the rim, the kind of vessel no one sets out in a formal hall, holding a single sprig of winter-flowering jasmine. The Duke went very still. He looked at the cup for a long moment in the way that a man looks at something he did not expect to feel. Then he reached out and lifted it carefully with both hands and held it close enough to catch the scent. The jasmine was pale and small. It asked very little. It offered, very quietly, the fact that someone inside this cold house had thought to look for something living. "Who placed this here?" he asked. His voice was low. It was not a sharp question. It was the question of a man who genuinely wished to know. Mrs. Hartwell did not hesitate. "I could not say, Your Grace." She said it smoothly, as though she had been saying smooth things for 30 years, which she had. The hall is seen to by several pairs of hands. He looked at the cup once more. He set it down, gently, precisely, where it had been. He said nothing further on the matter. He allowed Mrs. Hartwell to lead him toward the library, and the footman followed, and the other servants dispersed with the quiet efficiency of those long trained to dissolve. The entrance hall fell empty. Eliza eased back from the door. She placed both hands flat against the cold plaster of the staircase wall and held them there, steadying herself. She breathed once, slowly, until the trembling in her knees had passed. She did not know what to make of the pause, of the careful way he had held the earthenware cup, of the question he had asked and let go. She did not know that she had already registered in some part of his attention that was older than thought. She believed herself still invisible. She believed that the jasmine and the cup and the whole quiet offering had passed through the great house without leaving a mark. She was wrong, though she had no way to know it yet, and so she went back down the stairs, and the house settled around the Duke like snow, and January held its breath and waited. The library at Ashmore Hall held its cold, the way old houses hold their grief, thoroughly, without apology, deep in the stone itself. Edmund Ashmore entered it near 9 o'clock, candle in hand, expecting warmth. January had settled into the hall like a house guest who had not been asked to leave. The grate was dark, the wood had been laid but never lit, and the coals sat in their scuttle untouched, as though the footman had performed the preparation and trusted the fire to light itself by some inherited estate obligation. Edmund set the candle on the mantelpiece. He stood a moment, looking at the dead grate. He was not a man who rang for things he could do himself. He knelt, arranged the kindling with the same quiet efficiency he had brought to everything since the funeral, and set the flame to it. The fire caught, slowly. He watched it, as men who are tired of thinking often watch flames, not reading them, simply letting them be present. And when the blaze had grown enough to cast a steadier light across the hearthstone, he noticed it. The grate had been blacked with uncommon care. He had seen blacked grates in 100 houses. He had seen the grey smears left along the iron lip, the coal dust ground into the hearthstone's edge, the casual corners where a brush had not quite reached. This one had none of that. The angles were clean. The iron itself had a depth to it, a quiet lustre that came not from haste but from patience. The hearthstone bore not a single dark mark. Whoever had done this work had treated the thing not as a chore, but as a small, serious occupation, the kind one undertakes alone, early, when no one is watching. Edmund sat back on his heels. He looked at the grate for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The hall ticked in the cold. He rang for Mrs. Hartwell. She came with the speed of a woman who had anticipated being summoned. He was standing by then, hands clasped behind him, the fire crackling at his back. He did not begin with pleasantries. He was too tired for pleasantries. "Who blacks this grate?" he said. Mrs. Hartwell's expression arranged itself into something neutral and composed. She clasped her hands at her waist. "Your Grace? The hearthstone is clean. The iron is properly done. I should like to know which of the staff takes such particular care with it." There was a pause. It was not long. Another man might not have noticed it at all. A quarter breath, perhaps, a fraction of hesitation before her answer settled into place. "All the staff maintain their stations equally, Your Grace. I see to it personally." Edmund looked at her. She met his gaze with the practised steadiness of a woman who had managed difficult men before. He let it pass. He thanked her, dismissed her, and stood alone with the fire he had lit himself in a room that should have been warm already. The pause, however, he did not dismiss. He folded it away, the way a man of careful habit folds a letter he has not yet decided what to do with. There was a question buried in it. He did not know yet what the question was. Below stairs, the evening had settled into its own rhythms. The copper pans wanted scrubbing, and Eliza had them lined along the work table, her bare hands pink with cold water and brick dust, her darned glove set aside on the window-sill so it would not be ruined. Cook moved about the kitchen in the slow, certain way of a woman in her own domain, checking the bread she had set to prove, tapping the lid of the soup pot with one considered finger. She paused behind Eliza without announcing herself. "The Duke is not like the old ones," Cook said. Her voice carried no particular weight, the way warnings often do not when they are given kindly. "He notices things, girl. You want to stay unnoticed." Eliza did not still her hands. She turned the pan, worked the brick dust into the seam, and kept her eyes on the copper. "I have had practice at that," she said quietly. The words cost her nothing in the saying of them. They were simply true. She had learned in her time at Haverstock House that a maid who was seen too clearly became a maid who was blamed too easily. She had learned to be thorough and invisible in equal measure. She had learned that precision, when it was noticed, was sometimes called ambition, and that ambition in a maid was rarely admired. She had learned above all to keep her hands busy and her face still. Cook said nothing in return. There was a sound behind Eliza, a ladle, a bowl, the quiet displacement of a larger serving than the evening portion usually allowed. When Eliza turned to wash her hands, she found the bowl had been set closer to her end of the table and fuller. She looked at it. She looked at Cook's broad back, already turned away toward the bread. She did not say "thank you" aloud. In the language of that kitchen, none was required. Above the fire Edmund had lit himself burned on in the library. The grate gleamed at its edges, clean angles, careful work, a small and serious occupation performed in the early hours when no one was watching. He had noticed it anyway. The order came on a Wednesday morning, delivered not with anger, but with something far more considered, the measured tone of a woman who had learned that cruelty, to be lasting, must wear the costume of duty. Mrs. Hartwell set the leather-bound inventory ledger on the kitchen table and did not look at Eliza when she spoke. "The coal cellar wants a full count," she said. "Every sack, every grade. You will have it done by Friday." The cook, stirring porridge at the range, did not turn around. The silence that followed was its own kind of comment. The cellar lay beneath the east wing, reached by a stone stair that wept moisture in January. There was no window, only a grate set high in the exterior wall, a rectangle of pale sky no larger than a folded letter, through which the cold came freely and the light arrived at an angle too steep to be useful. The coal dust had settled into every surface with the patience of something that understood it would outlast the people moving through it. The shelving, the iron brackets, the numbered tags tied to each stacked row of sacks. Eliza descended with a stub of tallow candle, the ledger tucked under one arm, and a pencil she had sharpened herself. She began. She counted through the first morning without speaking, the scratch of her pencil, the only sound. By afternoon, she had a system. Number the rows, note the grade, estimate the weight by the give of the burlap beneath her thumb, check each figure twice before moving on. The task was meant to humiliate. She decided quietly to make it thorough. In the margins beside her tallied columns she wrote in her small, careful hand observations that the ledger had never thought to request. Which grade was cut with slack and ash, which burned long and even without troubling the flues, which would leave a grey residue on the mantelpiece linen. No one had asked for the notes. That was, in its quiet way, the whole of it. On the second day, she found a spider working in the far corner near the anthracite, a large, deliberate creature, making repairs to its web with the unhurried patience of something that has been through worse and does not intend to speak of it. She watched it for a moment before returning to her tally. There was a kinship in the observation that she did not name. By the third evening she had finished. The final column was summed and checked twice over, the ledger closed, the pencil tucked inside the cover. Her hands were black past the wrist, the kind of stain that cold water and the pump in the yard would not fully undo before morning. She climbed the stone stair and came out into the kitchen passage to find it empty, the range banked to a whisper, the cook long retired. The house had pulled itself inward the way houses in deep January always do, drawing warmth toward its centre and leaving the outer passages and cellars to manage the cold as best they could. She should have gone to bed. She knew this. The pallet in the upper servants' room was narrow and the blanket worn thin, but the room sat above the kitchen and held its warmth through the night, and there was nothing to remain awake for. She did not go. The candle from the cellar had burned to a stub. She lit a fresh one from the kitchen tinder-box and stood a moment in the corridor, watching the flame find its steadiness. Then, without quite deciding to, she began to walk, not toward the stairs, but along the back passage, the one she had learned in her first week here, not from hope, but because she could not prevent herself from knowing the shape of a place she was permitted to inhabit and yet not, in any felt sense, to claim. Her feet moved quietly on the flagged floor. The house slept around her. At the end of the passage there was a low door she had passed a dozen times before, the servants' entrance to the library, used in daylight for bringing wood to the grate and otherwise ignored. She had never tried the latch. Tonight she pressed it. The door swung open without resistance and the warmth of the room came out to meet her, as though it had been waiting. She stepped inside. The fire had settled well past its height and lay as coals now, a steady breathing orange that gave warmth rather than light. The shelves rose on three walls, hundreds of volumes, perhaps thousands, their spines catching the glow in small gilded intervals. She had not until that moment understood that a room could hold so many words and keep such perfect silence. She did not move toward the shelves. It did not occur to her that she was permitted to touch anything here. She stood near the door with her candle held in both palms and looked, the way one looks at the sea from a shore one has not earned, not reaching toward it, only letting its scale arrive. The coals shifted once. She watched them settle. Then she turned to go. "You may take one, if you like." The voice came from the wing-back chair beside the far window, low and unhurried, carrying neither accusation nor any quality she had spent the walk here bracing for. "I will not tell anyone." The library fire had burned low since she last tended it, though she had been the one to lay it fresh only hours before. The ash had settled in the grate with the particular quietness of things that have given everything they possess. She still stood near its fading warmth, her back to the wing-back chair, when the door opened. Not her door, not a door she had any right to be near, but the library door, and she had counted on it being empty. It was not empty. She did not run. She had learned in the years since the brooch and the magistrate's clerk and Mrs. Hartwell's particular silence that flight invited the worst constructions, stillness invited only questions. She turned, and she curtsied, and she said, very quietly, that she had come for the warmth and not the books. She hoped that distinction would matter to him. The Duke of Grantham looked at her for a moment without speaking. His eyes were red at their edges, the particular red of sleeplessness, or of grief that has been sitting in a room for some time, and has not yet finished with its occupant. He was still in evening dress, though it was well past 2 in the morning, and the cravat at his throat had been loosened with the weariness of a man who had abandoned ceremony some hours ago, and not thought to mourn it. He gestured toward the other chair. It sat across the hearth from his own, a low chair, with worn brocade at its arms, the sort of chair that had held many people at their ease and might hold one more. He said, without ceremony, that he would not make her stand. She sat on the very edge of it. Her back stayed straight. She kept her hands folded in her lap, and her weight tilted forward as a person keeps their weight who has not yet decided to remain. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire breathed quietly between them, its small ticks and shifts of cooling ember, the only sound the house permitted at that hour. January pressed its cold forehead against the dark glass of the window and waited, as January always does. Then he asked what she did in this house. She told him she did whatever Mrs. Hartwell required of her. He looked at her steadily. He said, without raising his voice, that this was not what he had asked. She paused, only the length of a breath drawn with care, a small accounting made behind the eyes. She had answered that question before in other houses for other people, and it had never once served her well to answer plainly. But something in his manner of looking, not the cold survey she had come to expect from gentlemen, not the look that tallied risk before settling on her face, something in it was asking for plain, and she found she had an answer. "I black grates, your grace," she said. "I keep things burning that others forget to tend." He did not answer at once. He studied her in the way a person studies something half recognized, uncertain whether knowledge is arriving now or only the wish for it. It was not a comfortable thing to sit beneath. It was not unkind. It was simply a steadiness she had not known from men of his position, and she did not quite know where to place it. A slim volume lay on the low table beside his chair, face down against its spine as though set aside mid-thought. The paper was pale and worn at its edges. He reached for it without looking away from her, turned it once in his hands, and held it out across the narrow space between the chairs. She saw the name on the cover, John Clare, poems chiefly from manuscript. She knew the name, though she had never held the book. She took it from his hand. She did not thank him, not from ingratitude, but because gratitude in this house had always come with a ledger attached, a quiet accounting of what would be owed in time, and she had not yet taken the measure of this one. Until she had, thanks would keep where they were. He seemed to understand. He did not look offended. He looked as though he had expected precisely that answer, and found it neither wrong nor right, only honest. The fire settled again. A small coal broke and fell, and the light shifted by a fraction, warmer briefly before it withdrew to its long amber quiet. She should go. She knew it. The book rested in her hands, its cover worn smooth at the corners by some earlier reader's thumb, and she traced the edge of it once and said nothing. There was a quality of silence in this room that she had not expected, not the silence of a house that is waiting for you to leave, the other kind. She rose from the edge of the chair and curtsied again, because courtesy was the one thing she was permitted to keep entirely for herself, and she moved toward the door. He did not call her back. He did not watch her go in the manner of men who catalogue departures. He had already turned toward the window, where January pressed its cold patience against the glass, and if he watched anything in those last, quiet moments, it was only the dark. The servant's stair newel post held the book when she came down in the grey of early morning, her breath clouding before her, her boots not yet laced at the top. She saw it at once. The John Clare volume returned without ceremony, leaned against the carved oak as though it had simply found its way home. Eliza stopped on the second step and looked at it a moment before she descended. She lifted it carefully, as one lifts a thing belonging to another, and felt, between the pages, the slight resistance of something folded. She opened the cover. A sprig of winter-jasmine lay pressed against the frontispiece, pale yellow, papery, the same variety she had arranged 3 days ago in the hall vase, the stems cut at the angle she preferred. There was no note, only that. She closed the book around it again and put it in her apron pocket, and carried it with her through the morning, as though it weighed something more than paper and pressed flour. She did not speak of it. There was no one to speak to. She went about her tasks with her usual precision, the darned glove on her left hand, her mother's thimble in her pocket beside the book, and the morning passed as mornings did at Ashmore Hall in January, slow and cold and lit with a pale light that asked nothing of anyone. But the book was there. She felt it with each step. 2 days later, the steward, Mr. Fenwick, came to find her where she was folding linens in the scullery passage, and told her, with the flat manner of a man delivering information rather than opinion, that her assignment to the coal cellar had been revised. She would take the east wing linen rooms instead. Cold work, he said, but daylit. She thanked him and asked no questions, for she had learned at Ashmore Hall that questions invited answers one did not want. She carried her things to the east wing that afternoon and set them down beside a window that faced the garden, where the frost still held the ground in its January grip, and the light came in pale and level and true. She did not know then how the order had travelled. She did not know that it had passed through the steward expressly so that it might arrive without a name attached. She would not have known where to look for such a thing. She simply went where she was sent and did what she was asked, and the east wing linen rooms were cold, but they were lit, and cold she could manage. On the first evening the library door stood unbolted when she passed it. She went to bed. On the second evening the same. On the third she pushed the door open and went in. The fire was low. The room smelled of old leather and the particular cold that settles in high-ceilinged rooms after dark. She chose a chair near the window rather than the hearth, because the window was further from the door, and she read aloud to herself very softly, as she had learned to do as a child, her voice barely above a breath. She did not know how long she sat. She knew only that at some point she became aware of footsteps in the corridor beyond, a slow, considered tread, and that they came to the door and stopped. She did not lift her eyes from the page. The footsteps did not resume. After a long moment she heard them withdraw, and the corridor was silent again, and she went on reading in the quiet that remained. She told herself it was the steward making his rounds. She almost believed it. The next morning she was crossing the back stairs with a pile of pressed linens when she heard his step on the landing below and knew it at once. Knew it by the weight of it, the unhurried quality, and then he was there, at the turn of the stair, and there was nowhere particular to go. He looked at the linens, then at her. "Clare, or someone else tonight?" he said. She considered the question with the gravity it seemed to deserve. "Someone else," she said. "I ran out of his sorrow." He was quiet a moment. "That happens," he said. A beat of silence opened between them, the kind that is not uncomfortable so much as careful, the kind that holds its shape because neither party moves to break it. Then he stepped aside, clearing the narrow stair, and she went past him with her linens and did not look back. She did not know what to make of a man who asked after her reading as though it were a natural thing to ask. She did not know what to make of a book left on a newel post, or a task reassigned through a chain of intermediaries so that no hand could be clearly seen. She put these things away in a part of herself she did not examine closely, and went on with her day. Mrs. Hartwell was coming from the direction of the south passage when she saw him. The Duke of Grantham, emerging from near the back stairs alone at 7:15 in the morning. She did not speak. She did not change her expression. She simply noted it with the still, methodical attention of a woman who keeps accounts, and her face in that moment became the flat, careful face of a woman who has begun, very quietly, to plan. The house did not notice. The house was only cold and lit, and January. The morning light came thin through the tall windows of the Duke's study, pale as pressed linen, and Mrs. Hartwell stood before the great oak desk, with the careful stillness of a woman who has rehearsed her entrance. She had chosen the hour well, after breakfast, before the steward's reports, when the house was neither too busy nor too quiet, when the Duke was most likely to be settled and alone. She set the letter upon the desk with both hands, as though it were a document of some considerable weight and consequence, which she supposed it was. "I should not wish to bring this to your grace," she said, "were it not a matter of duty. A woman of my position cannot in conscience hold her tongue, when the character of a person in this household, a person who has lately been afforded certain liberties, must be called into question." The Duke did not look up from the letter at once. He read it in full, and then he read it again, and his expression did not change by so much as the set of his jaw. The study was very still. Outside, a rook called once from the elm and fell silent. The letter was brief and merciless in the way that brief documents often are. It named Eliza Graves, late of Haverstock House, and it named the charge, theft of a silver brooch, the property of Lady Vance, unproven but uncontested. She had been dismissed without reference. The words were formal and dry and left no room for doubt to breathe. Hartwell stood with folded hands and a carefully downcast expression and said that she had kept the matter entirely private. It had not, she assured his Grace, passed beyond herself. She would not have wished to prejudice the household against a woman who had not yet been formally heard. She wished only to discharge her duty. "I could not in good conscience," she said, "allow a woman of this character any further proximity to your Grace's person or his property." Her voice was the voice of deep reluctance. She had practised that as well. The Duke set the letter down. He looked at it a moment longer, as one looks at a thing one finds difficult to admire. Then he said, "Who else in the house has seen this?" Mrs. Hartwell said, very softly, that she had shown it to no one, which was not entirely true. The cook had heard. She had heard 2 days since over the slow salting of a joint in the low and careful tones of a confidence that was never quite meant to be kept. The kitchen had been quiet that afternoon, and sound carries in a quiet kitchen. He asked one more question. He asked it without raising his eyes from the page, in the same measured register he used for everything, that level voice which gave so little away and yet carried weight, as still water does. Was she given the chance to answer the charge at the time it was made? Mrs. Hartwell clasped her hands a little more firmly. It was not, she said, the custom of the house. The fire shifted in the grate and a coal settled with a soft report. The Duke said, "No, it never is." He lifted his pen and drew a line beneath the page, as though closing an account. He thanked Mrs. Hartwell for her conscientiousness and dismissed her without a ruling. She left the room uncertain whether she had won, which was itself a kind of answer. Eliza learned of it not from him. She learned of it from the scullery girl, who was 13 and could not help herself, who came into the kitchen with wide eyes and that breathless quality of a person carrying something too large for her small frame. She had heard it from the dairymaid, who had heard it from the footman's boy, who had heard. The chain of it did not matter. What mattered was the word brooch, said in a careful whisper, and the word letter, and Eliza knew at once what had come loose and found its way to the surface, as things buried in cold ground will sometimes do. She set down the copper pan she had been drying. She set it down carefully, without a sound, on the stone edge of the sink. Then she sat on the low stool beside the window and folded her hands in her lap, and her hands were steady. Outside the glass, January had gone grey and close. A fine snow had begun to fall, the kind that does not settle, that appears and vanishes without committing itself to the earth. She had been here before, not in this house, not in this cold light, but in this precise interior country, where the ground drops away without warning, and there is nothing to take hold of. She had learned, in the years since Haverstock House, not to argue, and not to weep, and not to explain herself to people who have already decided what they will believe. She sat very still, and breathed the cold air coming through the gap in the casement, and let her thoughts settle like silt. The copper pan held the low winter light. Somewhere above her the house continued its afternoon, unhurried and unaware that the ground had shifted slightly beneath one of its rooms, the way ground does before a thing is lost. She rose when she was needed, and did not rise before. She did not wait. That was the first thing. Eliza Graves had learned in 4 years of service that waiting invited the kind of exit that stripped a person of what little composure they had left to them, and so she rose before the household bell and began, in the pale grey hour, before the kitchen fires were lit, to fold her few things into the cloth she had carried from her mother's house. The darned glove went first. She had mended it so many times that her own threads had long since replaced the original wool in the places that mattered, but she pressed it flat and set it at the centre of the cloth as though it were something of real value, because to her it was. The length of ribbon followed, still carrying faintly the smell of lavender from a summer she could barely picture now. Her mother's thimble she held for a moment in her palm, feeling its familiar weight, its worn silver lip, where the metal had thinned with long use, before placing it gently beside the ribbon. Then she paused. The John Clare volume sat on the shelf above the linen press where she had set it the previous evening. She had meant to read the last section, the Marsh poems, but the letter had arrived before supper, and after that she had found no appetite for beauty. She reached for the book now. The leather was cool and faintly dusty, as borrowed things often were. She turned to the page she had marked with a pressed sprig of jasmine, found in the east wing garden last September, when the afternoons were still mild enough to open the windows, and looked at the lines she had read perhaps a dozen times. Then she closed the book and returned it to the shelf. It was not hers. It had never been hers to take. She stepped back from it and did not look at it again. The grate still wanted attention. She could see that plainly even in the half-light. And Eliza Graves could not leave a grate unblacked regardless of the circumstances that compelled her departure. She knelt on the cold stone and opened the tin and worked with the same deliberate strokes she had always used, spreading the black in even passes, working it into the corners, leaving no streak, no missed patch, no sign of hurry or inattention. The east wing hearth would be clean when the next girl came to light it. That girl would not know whose hands had done this final work. No one would know, and Eliza found with a surprise that she did not mind. She had always done the work for the sake of the work itself, and that had not changed. She wiped her hands and stood. In the kitchen passage she found a scrap of paper beside the candle holder and wrote in her careful and unhurried hand a short note for cook. Not a farewell. There were no words for a farewell that would not embarrass them both, but a method. The copper pieces in the scullery had been dulling too quickly because the junior girls were using vinegar without the salt, and good polish was being wasted. She wrote it out plainly. Salt first, then vinegar. Rub with a dry cloth before the mixture could dry on the metal. 3 lines. She tucked the paper beneath the salt cellar, where cook would find it in the morning. It was the only useful thing she knew to leave behind. The narrow basement window looked out onto the north lawn. January had pressed its cold hand flat across everything. The grass was rimed white, each blade sealed and still, and the plane trees at the far edge of the park stood bare against a sky the colour of pale pewter. Eliza stood at the glass for what she allowed herself to be a long moment. She was not a woman who wept often or easily. She was not weeping now, but she rested one hand against the stone of the sill and looked out at the frost as though she wished to fix it properly in her memory, the particular shade of it, the stillness, the way the light moved so slowly across the lawn in winter. I had only just begun to be warm, she said aloud, to the glass, to the frost, to no one. Her voice was small in the empty passage. The house did not answer. Houses did not answer. She was aware of that perfectly well. But January light moved across the lawn in a slow, pale wash as a cloud shifted above, and the frost flared very briefly silver before settling to white again. She picked up her bundle and went to the stairs. Upstairs, in the linen room she had left tidy and locked, the Duke of Grantham passed the shelf on his way to the east passage and stopped, without knowing quite why. The John Clare volume stood between a spent candle and a length of folded cloth. He had placed it there for her. He had not expected to see it returned. He lifted it from the shelf. The book fell open at a marked page, and from the leaves there fell a sprig of pressed jasmine, pale gold and translucent at the edges now, still carrying the faintest possible suggestion of what it had once been. He stood with it in his open palm and understood, in the particular way that understanding comes when it is already too late to be of any use, that she had not waited to be asked. The library fire had burned low by the time Edmund Ashmore set down his pen. 2 letters lay sealed before him on the writing table, their wax cooling in the January dark. One was addressed to his solicitor in London, the other bore the name of a county magistrate whose jurisdiction touched the village where Eliza had formerly served. He rang for the footman and sent them both out into the cold that same evening, and felt, in doing so, something uncommon, the particular steadiness of a man who has begun to act rather than to endure. He did not sleep that night. He told himself it was habit, the old insomnia of a house grown too quiet, but in truth it was the ledger. He had not been able to set the thing down. He had found it in the coal cellar, a household inventory book, worn at the spine, its columns filled in the precise hand of a woman who had learned that precision was its own form of dignity. Eliza had made her marginal notes in a smaller script, neater still, observations on quantities, suggestions written so gently they barely asked to be noticed. Perhaps an additional quarter sack before the 3rd week of January, when the east wind comes in under the garden door. He read that line once. He read the ledger from beginning to end a second time. There was nothing remarkable in it. That was what he could not set aside. The coal cellar inventory was the record of ordinary diligence, carried out by a woman no one had thought to consult about anything beyond coals, and yet she had noticed the east wind, had noted the garden door, had thought ahead without being asked to think at all. She had been in his employ a matter of weeks. She had tended to things as though she expected to stay for years. He set the ledger on the desk and waited for morning. The solicitor's letter arrived on the 2nd day. The magistrates arrived the same afternoon, as though the post had conspired toward a single revelation. Edmund read them both in the library, standing by the window, without sitting down. The brooch had been found in the belongings of the household's own lady's maid, who had already left the family's service when the discovery was made. The accusation against Eliza had been permitted to stand, because to correct it would have required the family to admit they had dismissed a young woman unjustly. No letter of restoration had ever been written. No word had been sent. She had been released into the world carrying a name that was not hers, because the alternative would have required someone to be wrong, and wrong in writing, and wrong in a way that others might see. Edmund set both letters on the table. He picked up the solicitor's summary and read a passage aloud into the empty room, as a man sometimes does when he needs to hear a thing spoken before he can be certain it is real. Then he laid the paper down and said, quietly, to no one at all, she was blamed because it was convenient and released because no one wanted the bother of being wrong. He stood for a moment in the stillness. I know that mechanism. He did know it. He had lived inside it for 3 years. There had been a physician in the village less than 2 miles from Ashmore Hall, and his wife had grown ill in the night, and the house had been too proud, or too uncertain, or too afraid of what it meant to send for a surgeon at 2 in the morning. No one had wanted to be the one who alarmed everyone unnecessarily. No one had wanted to be wrong. And so, no one had gone. She had died before dawn of something that might not have killed her, in a house full of people who had made the small, quiet, collective choice to wait. He understood then what the solicitor's letter had told him, that the solicitor himself had not known he was saying. It was not that Eliza had been treated with unusual cruelty. She had been treated with ordinary cowardice, the simple human preference for inconvenience over admission. He had been subject to the same preference. He had stood on the other side of it, and it had cost him everything he had thought was permanent. He was not going to stand there a second time. He crossed the library to the door and went out into the corridor. He walked down the servants' stairs, the back passage, a route he had not taken since the early years of his marriage, and found cook at the range with a cloth over her shoulder and startled eyes. "Your Grace," she said, setting down her spoon. "Miss Graves," he said. "Where is she?" Cook looked at him steadily, the way women of long service look at their employers in moments that matter, measuring not what has been asked, but why it is being asked now, and what the answer will cost. "She left this morning, Your Grace," Cook said, "early, before the fire in the front rooms was laid." The kitchen was warm. The fire crackled once in the range. Edmund stood in a room he had not entered since his boyhood, and felt the full weight of that single word, early, and what it meant that he had not moved sooner. "Which road?" he said. The eastern gate of Ashmore Hall stood half open in the January grey, its iron hinges dressed with frost, and Eliza Graves stood beside it with a cloth bundle folded over her arm, and her breath making small clouds in the still air. The carrier cart would not come for another hour, perhaps 2. She knew this, and she waited anyway, because waiting at the gate was preferable to waiting inside a house that had already decided it was finished with her. The morning offered nothing by way of comfort, no wind, no bird song, only the flat light of a winter sky that had forgotten the colour of blue. The bundle was not heavy. It had never been heavy. A woman who moved between houses learned quickly to hold nothing that could not be carried in one arm. She heard footsteps on the gravel before she saw him. They were too quick and too uneven for a servant's measured pace, and when she turned, the Duke of Grantham was crossing the sweep of the drive in his morning coat and nothing more, no greatcoat, no hat. his dark hair untidy from what she suspected was not sleep, but the restless movement of a man who'd been trying to think clearly in a cold room. She noticed the absence of the coat before she noticed anything else. A man who had left the house too quickly to think about warmth. There was something unexpectedly plain about him in that moment, something stripped of the architecture of rank. He stopped several feet from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. A robin that had been sitting on the top bar of the gate considered the situation and departed. "Miss Graves," he said, which was already more than most men of his station would have troubled themselves to say, "the brooch matter has been resolved. My solicitor has the letter. The magistrate will have his copy before the week is out. The record will be corrected." He paused. "I'm sorry. For the time it took. For the 3 years before that time." She looked at him steadily. She had not spent 3 years learning steadiness for nothing. "That will not give me back the 3 years," she said. "No," he said. "I know it will not." She shifted the bundle slightly on her arm, not from discomfort, only from the habit of a woman who had learned to keep her hands occupied when her thoughts were running faster than her composure. The wool of the bundle was damp at one corner from the frost on the gate-post where she had briefly rested it. "Why are you telling me this at a gate in January, Your Grace?" He did not answer immediately, which he had not expected. Men of rank in her experience always had an answer prepared, something gracious and conclusive that closed a door while appearing to open one. The Duke of Grantham stood in the cold without a coat and appeared to be genuinely searching for a reply, as though he had come down the drive with one thing prepared and arrived to find that it was not, after all, sufficient. "Because I did not tell you before you left," he said at last, "and I found I could not let that stand." She considered this. It was not a complete answer, and she suspected he knew that as well as she did. A gentleman's regret, she had learned through careful observation, was often the prologue to a new expectation, to gratitude, to reassurance, to the tidy resolution that left the gentleman's conscience settled and the woman's situation entirely unchanged. She had learned to recognize the structure of it too well. She had been the instrument of other people's resolutions before. She had no appetite for it. "What is it that you want from this moment?" she asked. The question was plain, and she meant it to be. "You have told me. The record will be corrected. That is a proper thing, and I thank you for it. But you are standing at a gate in the cold without your coat, and there is a carrier cart coming, and I should like to understand what this conversation is." He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the distant sound of the kitchen door, somewhere far behind the east wing, opening and closing. Someone beginning the morning's work, unknowing, indifferent to the particular quality of this silence. "I do not have a clean answer ready," he said. "I thought I did when I came down the drive. I find I do not." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard a man of his position say. She looked at him then, not with the careful, lowered attention she had trained herself to offer, in the presence of those with power over her circumstances, not with the guardedness that had kept her safe through 3 years of navigating other people's houses and other people's judgments. She looked at him directly, the way one looks at something unfamiliar that has not yet shown whether it means harm. It was not warmth. She was nowhere near warmth, and she did not pretend otherwise, even to herself, who had seen the cost of pretending more than once, but it was the beginning, perhaps, of being willing to hear. The frost lay white and even on the iron bars of the gate. The morning held its breath around them both, grey and still and waiting for something that had not yet been decided. The cold came off the stones of the eastern passage like a held breath finally released, and Eliza stood in the doorway a moment longer than was necessary, the cloth bundle pressed to her chest, and the January air still caught in the wool of her shawl. Edmund Ashmore did not take her arm. He stepped back and let the warmth of the corridor come to her on its own terms, which was, she understood without his saying so, precisely the point. She crossed the threshold. The door closed behind them with the quiet weight of old oak, and neither of them moved toward the formal rooms. The servants' corridor ran plain and stone-floored between the kitchen wing and the back stairs, lit by a single oil lamp that had been burning long enough to coat the bracket with a thin shadow of smoke. It was not the house's face. It was its spine. He had brought her here and not elsewhere, and that, too, was a choice both of them recognized without speaking it. She heard him speak to the footman quietly, a few words she could not catch. Then he was gone down the passage, and the lamp guttered once in the draught and steadied. She waited. She was not certain what she was waiting for, only that something had shifted in the weight of the air, as though Ashmore Hall itself had drawn a slower breath. The bundle in her arms was heavier than it had been at the eastern gate, though nothing in it had changed. Objects know when they are being held differently. She pressed it closer and listened to the house breathe around her, the low, even exhalations of old stone in winter, pipes contracting somewhere in the walls, a shutter loose above, the distant percussion of cook's work in the kitchen proper. They came in ones and twos, and then together. Mrs. Hartwell, her ring of keys at her side and her face arranged in the particular blankness she wore when she suspected she was about to disapprove of something. The steward, Mr. Fenwick, who had been in service at Ashmore longer than any of them and whose eyebrows seldom moved. Cook, flour still white on her left wrist, which she had not thought to brush away. The footman, Thomas, who was young and not yet schooled in hiding what he thought. They arranged themselves in the passage as though the corridor were a receiving room, which it was not, but the Duke had assembled them here, and so here they stood. No one looked at Eliza directly. She looked at no one. Edmund Ashmore clasped his hands behind his back. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. He said that he was telling them something they would want to know before they heard it from any lesser source, that the matter of Miss Eliza Graves and the accusation brought against her 3 years prior had been placed before a magistrate and reviewed by his solicitor, and that the record would be corrected. He paused in the way he had of letting a sentence settle before the next. He said he was asking Miss Graves to remain at Ashmore Hall. He said her name again, the full name, unhurried and unabbreviated, as though he had weighed it and found it worth the carrying. The silence that came after was not the silence of assent. It was something older and less comfortable, the silence of a room of people setting down one version of the world, and not yet having reached for another. Mrs. Hartwell was the first to gather herself. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried that careful evenness of a woman who has spent 30 years perfecting the art of disagreement by implication, the propriety of such an arrangement. She did not finish the sentence. The Duke turned his head toward her, not unkindly, in the manner of a man who has heard the objection and found it insufficient. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "That will do." 4 words, level as flagstones. Mrs. Hartwell closed her mouth. The steward looked at the wall. Cook's hands folded quietly over each other at her waist. Thomas the footman looked at his shoes. Edmund Ashmore turned back to Eliza. He took 2 steps toward her, which brought him close enough that she could see the last of the January cold still fading from the collar of his coat, and he spoke quietly, so that only she could hear what passed between them. "I am not asking you to be anything you have not already been," he said. "I am only asking you to be it here, where I can see you." His voice did not waver. His eyes did not look away. There was no grace note in it, no appeal to sentiment, only that plain and irrevocable honesty she had glimpsed at the gate and not quite known what to do with. Eliza held the cloth bundle against her chest and did not speak. She felt the warmth of the passage reaching her now slowly, the way warmth always comes when one has been cold for a very long time. She had not yet answered. The lamp on the wall held its small flame steady, and the house of Ashmore held its breath around them both, and she stood in the spine of it, and thought that 3 years was a very long time, and that she was still thinking about it, and that perhaps that was not quite the same thing as no. Eliza set the cloth bundle down on the kitchen table without ceremony, no flourish, no announcement, only the quiet decision of a woman who had grown tired of carrying everything she owned pressed against her chest. She had not yet said yes aloud. She said it instead with her hands, releasing the bundle, smoothing the cloth flat, and turning back to the room as though she had always meant to stay. No one remarked upon it. The kitchen girl continued peeling turnips. The cook moved the kettle. Ashmore Hall received her choice in the way that houses receive most things, in silence and with its full attention. In the weeks that followed, the house shifted in small calibrations, the kind that go unnoticed until one morning you see them all at once and understand that something has settled. The library bolt was left drawn back by consent now, rather than forgetfulness. A second cup appeared on the breakfast tray the steward carried to the east wing, and no one remarked upon it, because some changes announce themselves only by becoming ordinary. The housekeeper ceased to redirect Eliza when she passed through the main corridor. The kitchen maid began to ask her opinion of the soup. A vase of dried lavender appeared on the window-sill of the room she had been given. Not the attic, this time, and she understood, without needing to ask, that the room was hers. The Duke had chosen it himself. He did not say so, but Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned it to the steward, and the steward had not been quite careful enough with his expression when Eliza asked. The room faced south and caught the morning light. They took to walking the gravel paths after supper, when the light had gone blue and the house breathed cold around them. He spoke of the estate's history, the south field that had flooded 3 times in a century, the kitchen gardens laid out by his grandfather to face east for the morning warmth, the peculiar arrangement of the elm walk that made no architectural sense, but which his mother had loved and so had remained. No one had asked about these things in years. He had forgotten, perhaps, that they were interesting, or perhaps he had simply stopped believing that anyone wished to know. She asked questions. He answered as though they mattered, and slowly understood as he spoke that they did, not merely as history, but as the texture of a life he had very nearly stopped tending. "You know more about this land than you let on," she said one evening. "I know what I was taught," he said. "I had stopped thinking it worth the telling." She did not answer immediately. She had learned, by then, that silence between them was not emptiness, but a kind of consideration, each giving the other room to finish thinking. On an evening in early March, when the winter-jasmine had begun to show yellow along the kitchen garden wall, a thin, determined yellow, the colour of a thing that does not require permission to return, he stopped on the gravel path and stood very still for a moment as though deciding. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the matter of the brooch correction letter, whether it ought to name this house as a place of redress so that any future employer of yours would see it clearly." She was quiet. A thrush called once from the elm walk and did not call again. "I don't think I will need a future employer," she said at last. "Do you?" He looked at her. The jasmine moved faintly in a cold breath of air. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has only now been told he may set it down. "No," he said. "I rather think I don't." They walked on. The gravel settled under their feet. There was nothing more required. In the library that night, Eliza sat in the chair closest to the fire, the chair that had been moved there, she suspected, at someone's instruction, though no one had confirmed it. The John Clare volume lay open in her lap, the spine no longer stiff, the pages softened from use. The fire burned as a library fire ought to burn, steadily, properly tended, throwing its warmth in an even arc across the hearthrug. A second chair had been drawn close, angled toward hers by few considerate degrees. It was empty. It would not always be. Outside, the frost had left the lawn. The parkland lay quiet under an early March sky, the colour of pewter, warming towards silver, and somewhere along the kitchen garden wall, the jasmine continued its unhurried business of returning. Ashmore Hall had been a house of locked doors and careful silences for long enough. It was remembering, very slowly, what it had been built to hold. Not grandeur, not performance, not the appearance of order, but the ordinary warmth of two people at rest in the same room, without fear, without pretense, without the need to explain how they came to be there at all. Eliza turned the page. The fire settled. Outside, the house was quiet in the way that only content houses are. The hall breathed around her, and for the first time in a very long while the breath of it was easy.